Hey everybody, thanks so much for watching again as we get ready for another great Sunday night youth group together. We're in week 2 of All Access, our Easter sermon series. And so we were talking last week about because of Jesus, we have an all access pass to God. Now, this week we're looking at our lives and saying there are times in our lives where we feel like we do fall short and where we don't have all access to God. And I think sometimes that falls into some temptations that we're tempted to do things, sometimes good things, sometimes not so good things. But sometimes, I mean, I think like Halloween, you're tempted to like have an extra piece of candy, or at Christmas, you're tempted to look in on the presents, on the big bag of presents, and it's not a big deal. The consequences are small, but there's also temptations and life stuff that we face that is much bigger to deal with. Things that we wish that would simply go away and stay away. Maybe for you or for our students, it's gossiping or cheating or lying or fighting or complaining or laziness, but it might be something else. You don't have to come to church to know there are things in life that we shouldn't do because they're going to hurt us. But you already know that. In fact, you've probably already felt consequences of things that we're tempted to do that have hurt us. In any case, our students are definitely old enough to have figured out that there are some choices that can hurt us. And here's the weird thing. We still do them. And a lot of times we say, well, I just can't help myself. And actually, researchers would agree with you. The more researchers understand about the human brain, the more they confirm that the willpower, the strength to resist temptation, is a lot like a muscle. It fatigues, it gets tired, it runs out of power. That's encouraging, right? I mean, gosh, I wish that wasn't true, but what do we do if our willpower runs out of power sometimes? What do we do when we know we shouldn't say yes, but we don't feel like we have the power to say no? Now, a lot of us have the idea that when it comes to the bad stuff that we do, God's mad. That his answer to us is in a very stern voice saying, try harder. And so it's just easier to keep our distance. And we began this series by looking at the book of Hebrews, a letter written to some of the Jewish people who had begun to follow Jesus, the very first Christians. And we discovered that when Jesus came, it destroyed all the previous way of doing things. Jesus gave people all access to God. That was last week. Now, this week, we're looking at that very same letter written to the Jewish Christians there that gives us insight into things about God and Easter that most of us have never thought about. And what the writer has to say has the power to change how we react to every temptation that we face. And it says this in Hebrews chapter 4. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we do have one who's been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Now, we get stuck so much on that last part that Jesus did not sin, but don't get caught up in that part that you miss the first part. The writer says that Jesus was able to empathize. That means that Jesus was able to feel what you feel. He knows your frustration. And what may surprise you is that he knows because he's been there. Even though Jesus didn't sin and give in, Jesus was tempted in every single way that you and I have been tempted. And so it goes on to say, as we realize that reality, that Jesus empathizes with us because he's felt it, it then says, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. That's just a few verses later. So we can take our temptations to Jesus and he will help us out in our time of need. Why? Because he's been there. Why is this such a big deal? Because when it comes to helping us out, really the only surefire place to find power is with God. Why is it a big deal? Because when it comes to helping us, Jesus actually can, and Jesus can help us fill in those gaps. So as we celebrate Easter, we're actually celebrating the fact that Jesus came back from the dead. He defeated both sin and death. Jesus had the power to live without sin, and when he was killed, he had the power to come back to life. Jesus never ran out of power, and that's great news for you and I. The Apostle Paul tells us this in Romans chapter 8. It says, the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. See, when your willpower runs out, when your life power kind of runs out and you just want to give in to temptation, you want to give in to things that you know aren't good because it's just easier to say yes than it is to say no. When your willpower runs out, you have access to Jesus's. So what do we do? Take it to Jesus. Take the difficulties and the things that you struggle with to Jesus. He's listening. But so often we're tempted to stop praying, to turn off the worship music, to skip small groups, to skip church. Take our life stuff to Jesus. And then be brave enough to trust what he says. See, if someone's willing to die for you and he doesn't want to make your life miserable, let's trust what Jesus says. And the last thing is tell someone else. See, God wired us for relationships. You don't have to do this by yourself. So tell somebody else the thing that you're struggling with, the thing that might be pulling you away from access to God, because you're made to do life together and they can help you navigate the difficulties of life. See, Easter is the constant reminder that we're not doomed when our power runs out because we have all access to God. And when we fall, we can confidently come back to God and get the grace and mercy that we need because of what Jesus did for us at Easter. So that's our discussion for this Sunday. We'll see you at 4:45 for our small group leader meeting. Looking forward to a great one. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.